Before dawn, dozens of demonstrators suddenly walked onto this farm.
Strangers marching through our place of business.
The farm's owner soon discovered that the strangers were union activists who wanted these farm workers to join their union. But the workers didn't know they were coming, and at 6 a.m. they were frightened.
You don't know if they're mad, they're going to get violent. It was a scary situation.
Listen, I had the chance to go ugly. What right do you have to be here?
Every right in California, because unions persuaded the state to allow them access to private farm properties.
If I didn't allow them in, I'm the one's going to jail. That is asinine. They don't have legal right to access private property.
They do in California.
Only if you produce an agricultural commodity. Otherwise, they do not.
That's because you rich farmers have been abusing these migrant workers who don't understand the rules.
That's what the union claims. Mike says it's absurd to say he abuses his workers because they keep coming back.
All right. I am Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined, as always, by our super producer, Jake Abbott, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. In just a few moments, we are going to be joined by Eric Blanc, author of this book. We have a graphic, We Are the Union, how worker-to-worker organizing is revitalizing labor and winning big, which I'm very excited to talk to him about. I was just having a conversation with my neighbor on Podcast Bro the other day about the importance of hearing something good and not just being a kind of constant stream of demoralizing negativity. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about the winning big. We are going to go straight in just a minute to Eric, because we're skipping the opening argument tonight because Eric actually has a emergency organizing meeting for federal workers to go to that he's part of, and we all had a big discussion about this, and should we still let him on the show, and we decided reluctantly that counted as a valid excuse.
Yeah, I was on the hard line. Our show, our terms. If you don't like it, leave. But Ben overruled me. So, and I think maybe I was getting a little heated. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, we had a 4-hour meeting. We all said things we wish we could take back. But it's beyond understandable. So this is the cold open with some anti-union propaganda from John Stossel. Andy, I think you found this for us.
Yeah, I actually have a soft spot in my heart for John Stossel because back in the 80s and early 90s, he was a bit of a liberal, and he honestly, he's a good storyteller whenever he does his stories. And I appreciate the way he tells the story. However, that one was just so bizarre because he's telling the story in favor of the boss.
It's the big scary thing is that farm workers who are trying to organize for better wages and conditions are doing so in the giant common area that everybody has, rather than having to go elsewhere, which, goddamn, it's a big government, can't leave people alone, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it was, I thought there was almost the perfect punchline of Stossel saying, but they have the right to be there, which, if he just changed his voice, it would be, but, they have the right to be there. But I feel like there is no better punchline than, there's no way I'm exploiting them because they keep coming back.
Which we all know is an impossibility, right? That there could be bad or abusive or underpaid conditions, and people would still prefer that to unemployment. That would be a situation totally unprecedented in the history of wage labor.
Yeah. Speaking of, is today's today is Karl Marx's birthday? I should know this off the top of my head, but
yeah.
Or was it? It is today, huh?
It is today. Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, yes, on Karl Marx's birthday, that employer maybe should read a little bit of Marx, and he might understand a little bit why those workers still think they're being exploited. But with that said, I think it's about high time that we get to our main interview. What do you think? What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I think so. I will see you guys at the top of the hour, and now we are joined by author, man about town, my Rutgers colleague, Eric Blanc. How are you doing, Eric?
Hey Ben, I'm good. Staying busy, so I'm less depressed than I would otherwise be.
Well, okay, so that actually does get into the first thing I wanted to ask you about. Before we really get into your book, which again is "We Are the Union: How Worker-to-Worker Organizing is Revitalizing Labor and Winning Big." I just kind of wanted to get a general temperature check from you about how you're feeling about the world right now, right?
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of of the word fascism. I don't think it's always helpful to escalate rhetoric to 11, but certainly in a lot of ways, there's this very shockingly authoritarian administration in power right now, and certainly very fanatically anti-union, getting into stuff we're going to be talking about. There's just generally been a tremendous amount of horrible shit going on nonstop. But I also know you're very involved, as we were just kind of joking about, in efforts by federal workers to push back. That's why we had to scramble up the schedule for tonight. So, I was hoping you just kind of start us off with just a general sense of where your head is at with all this right now.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, today and yesterday I was particularly depressed, not by the U.S., but by Israel's continual genocide and the escalation. Just when you think it couldn't get worse, they find a way to do that. And so, frankly, I find that just sort of heartbreaking on the day-to-day. And if it weren't for the labor organizing in the U.S., I honestly would feel pretty paralyzed, because it's not clear to me in the short term what exactly we can do to stop that. I obviously we speak out, but it's just, I find that heartbreaking and hard to process as a human. That being said, on the domestic front, I'm not as pessimistic as I was right after Trump got elected, and even in the first couple of weeks, because the basic reason is that Trump is fucking up, on his own terms. It's not just that he's done so much overreach, but the ability for him to impose a program of authoritarianism, billionaire corruption, depends on him doing smart moves, and a lot of what he's done has been pretty stupid, from his standpoint. So the tariffs, it's just if there's one basic thing you want to do as any politician, is not radically raise prices on people and then tell them it doesn't matter if they should suck it up. This is just really stupid politics.
Yeah. You could, maybe the little girls can only have 2 dolls.
So it's just there's one law in political science, as far as I know, which is that if you fuck up the economy, people will not like you. So so I think, as far as the ability, which was already, I think, growing because to push back against Trump, which was already actually, I think, very significant, because what he's doing is very unpopular, across the board. I'm sure you've talked about this, and I imagine a lot of your listeners are aware, but the level of unpopularity makes it so that there's promise for wide-scale resistance that could be successful in a way that wasn't so obvious to me even a month or 2 ago. And so I do think that it's an extremely contradictory situation, but the fact that Canada and Australia, you have all these, it's significant that people, even in other countries, are voting against Trump, contrary to the expectations that maybe this would be just the sign of every country going to the far right. Well, actually, people really don't like these policies, as far as a majority of people. So it's obviously very scary what's happening, but I do think that there's a huge opening. And I guess this is how I look at it, is really the liberal center obviously has collapsed. And so that creates a lot of space for the far right. But, my liberal aunt and is going to Bernie rallies now, the Democratic Party base is is anti-oligarchy and anti-billionaire. So it's a very potentially fruitful situation for the, I think, left and for the labor movement to fill this political vacuum.
Yeah, I like that a lot, and and it's like also worth noting. I mean, I think that organized labor, in particular, in lots of countries. I mean, I don't know. I'm just thinking here for like South Korea, because that's where I used to live for a few years, has played a huge role in building up resistance to authoritarian regimes, right? Like in countries that have gotten to that point, right? So if you're watching this, if you're somebody who's concerned about this, that the two subjects definitely do connect. You mentioned in that answer, you talked about tariffs and the economic chaos from that, and how the upside here is that it is making Trump very, very unpopular. And I did have one, before we get to your book, I did have one non-book question about this, because you also have a Substack. We have it linked in the description of the show, and you wrote something that I thought was really smart about this, about the tariffs and the sort of trade war aspect of the Trump insanity, and in particular about the ways that this is supposed to lead to reindustrialization, and like what's supposed to come out as a result of that, right? It's called, I think we have the graphic, Jake. It's called "Unions, Not Just Factories, Will Make America Great Again." And can you just kind of take us a minute to walk through the argument here?
Yeah, the short argument is that Trump is telling a story about American decline and reemergence that is wrong, and the basic problem with it is that he associates factory work as such with prosperity, when in fact factory jobs prior to unionization sucked really bad. They were like hellholes, until unionization made them both safer and not just sort of completely dictatorial regimes, and frankly made the wages a lot better, and so you can have a middle class lifestyle. So Trump talks in this way that, referring always back to this mythical 1950s type lifestyle, but in fact what he's pointing to is more of the Gilded Age era, which he also talks about sometimes, in which factory work was awful. And so just having a factory job doesn't make it inherently good. You need a union to make factory work good. And you can look at the US South today, where it's almost all non-union, to see just how bad the conditions could be. And I cite Matt Bruning on this, that factory workers' wages at Honda in the South are actually lower than McDonald's workers in Denmark. So there's no reason that all jobs couldn't be good jobs. You need a union to make that happen. And then the second piece from that is that even if we accept the premise, which it's really hard to know at this point, that Trump's policies will lead to some degree of manufacturing growth, because at this point it's just so much chaos. Why would anybody invest in anything at this point?
Yeah, you're just gonna like, as a capitalist, you're just gonna build a factory on the assumption that whatever the trade policies are this week are what they're going to be for like the next 10 years.
Yeah, right. So that, and it's actually in some ways bad, because I do think that the UAW, and I argue this, is right to support targeted tariffs. Targeted tariffs as part of an industrial policy to rebuild manufacturing is sort of like a longstanding classic, and can work. But that's not what this is. But even if we just leave that aside, if we say, well, even if the goal is to reindustrialize as much as possible, which as such is not a bad goal. Factory jobs have the potential to be very good jobs because they're capital intensive. You can win higher wages. The leverage for workers is higher. There's something particular about factory jobs that can be particularly fruitful for labor. But the problem is, just because of automation, essentially, you're never going to get anywhere back to the numbers of factory jobs that you had in the 1950s or earlier. The most you're going to get is move from, we're about 9-10% today to about 12-13% at the max if you go all in. And so this isn't a solution for the working class as a whole. It can be helpful, it can be useful, but there's just, because of automation, essentially no world in which you're going to reindustrialize to the levels of the 1930s or prior.
Yeah, I mean, I think something you say in the Substack, which makes a lot of sense to me, is that reshoring a few million auto jobs would actually be huge as far as the bargaining power of the UAW and the sort of willingness of workers to take risks with less fear of offshoring as a result. That all makes sense, but so it's not that Sean Fain and the UAW are wrong to argue for targeted tariffs. They're right, but it's this is just not a panacea, as far as the bigger picture goes, right? I mean, that given automation, you can't, you're not going to get back, as you just said, right, to the level of factory jobs that we just had, right? So the goal has got to be, right, figuring out, even if it's a much harder organizing task in some ways for reasons you get into in the book, figuring out how to make the rest of these jobs, good jobs through unionization. So, sticking with that point and
that's a good transition. Some A+ transitioning. I see that.
Thank you. I work on it. Sticking with that point, right? At the beginning of the book, you have this graph about the relationship between union density and inequality. Can you talk us through this?
Yeah, this is the graph to end all graphs, to understand what we're in. Why is the situation so dire? This is the relationship essentially between union power and inequality. And what you see is that when union density, so that's the percentage of the workforce in unions, goes up, inequality goes down, and when union density goes down, inequality ramps up. And so that's the background condition for the rise of MAGA, for the skyrocketing economic inequality, climate catastrophe. All of this stuff is essentially rooted in the power imbalance between workers and bosses. And the book is essentially an attempt to ask, what would it take to make this bottom line in the graph, union density, start going up again? Because everybody talks about it. On the left, a lot of people say, yeah, of course it'd be good for more unions. But the book is an attempt to actually ask the question and provide some potential answers for what would it take to organize tens of millions of workers to turn that graph around, to really address the inequality. You're going to have to literally organize tens of millions of workers. And asking that question is actually distinct from a lot of the debates that normally happen around labor and on the left, which is how do you win specific campaigns? You need to win campaigns in order to scale, but there's actually distinct questions of how to scale, and that's what the book tries to address.
Yeah, because look, it's very easy for people like me who are in the having political opinions business to sort of be like, oh yeah, what we really need to do is to have like much greater union density, right? Because that's really gonna, this is the sort of key for like everything else that ails the left and the sort of balance of power that's reflected in American politics, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all correct. But, there is this very obvious question, like once you say that enough times, like, okay, right, how are you going to do that? And I want to start where you start, laying out the core argument of the book in chapter 1. So define worker-to-worker organizing for me.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to compare it to what I'm contrasting it with, which is start off by staff-intensive unionism, which is essentially the norm of unionizing since at least the 1950s, and it's still really the norm today, in which you have to have about one staffer for every 100 workers you're trying to unionize. That's the ratio is considered best practice. Costs about $3,000 to organize one worker in the private sector, at least. And so it's very staff intensive. It's expensive at its best, because there's a lot of different forms this could take. At its best, it can be really effective. And so I'm not actually arguing that staff are bad or that resources are unimportant, or even that this type of organizing is not good. It can actually be very powerful. The problem is it just can't be powerful enough for enough workers. You can't scale it. You can't organize tens of millions of workers this way, for the basic reason that there's not enough money and there's not enough time. This method can't do that. So worker-to-worker organizing, in contrast, is a type of organizing in which a lot of the role of staff is taken on by worker leaders themselves. And so it's a lightly staffed form of organizing in which three things in particular are done by workers that are normally done by staff, or some combination of these. You don't necessarily need all three, but at least about two of the three to be something new. One is initiating campaigns. So it's not just the union and staff initiating the campaign. Workers themselves are oftentimes initiating, starting, doing the systematic organizing before they've reached out to a union. So what we've seen a lot over the recent years is workers like building an organizing committee, even winning a majority and then voting on which union to affiliate with. So that's a new dynamic. Second, training other workers. So normally it's a staff person is in charge of training a new drive that wants to organize. Here, oftentimes, it's been workers themselves training other workers. So one example I give in the book, there's a lot of them, is in Starbucks. You listeners might remember they won a union election in Buffalo. All of a sudden, then hundreds of workers across the country reach out. And if it'd been a staff-intensive drive, they just would have actually had to say no. And most unions, and in fact, a lot of unions have said no to this type of thing. Said we just don't have the capacity to try to go nationally. To go national, we don't have enough resources or staff because they didn't. But Starbucks, fortunately, took a different approach, and they had the workers themselves in Buffalo reach out, jump on a Zoom call, and start training workers across the country in how to organize. And so that, as a basic method of how you scale and how you talk to new workers, is also new. It's not staff talking and training, it's workers doing that. And then the third piece is strategizing. So oftentimes this is a question that's monopolized by staff. The big picture decisions about targets, when to file a union election, not just the small nitty-gritty tactics, but the big picture decisions. Oftentimes workers don't have a say in that. And in this, they do have a significant and often decisive say. So these are the three kind of factors that make it a more scalable form of organizing, because it's not as dependent on staff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. At the beginning of the second chapter, right, organizing in dispersed terrain, you have this really striking quote from William Z. Foster, the American communist leaders, writing in 1936. And he says, meetings should be held especially in popular neighborhood halls, where workers' fraternal lodges meet, where the workers dance, where their weddings take place, and where they are generally accustomed to going. And of course, you can hear that and immediately see that this was great advice in 1936. 2025, the terrain is very different. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I wish we could just hold our meetings in such halls if such halls existed.
Right,
and for the most part, they don't exist anymore. There's partial exceptions. It's not that this type of thing has completely gone away. Maybe, pockets of immigrant communities, maybe, but it's where it was more of the norm back then. Today, it's very exceptional and it's very rare. So that makes unionization harder, frankly, because working people just had a far richer and denser form of associational and cultural life. Of course, there was a lot of divisions back then. Racial divisions were much stronger, actually, than they were today. But on the whole, you didn't have to convince workers to get to know their coworkers because they were going to the same church. They were in the same sports league. They lived next to each other. And that terrain, insofar as obliterated, really by what I talk about in the book, decentralization of industry, suburbanization, just really dramatic changes over the last century, has made it far harder to organize. It's still possible, but it takes a lot more fostering. This is the big difference, is that you can still unionize, but oftentimes you have to get workers to build these relationships of trust before you can even fight the boss. Whereas in the past, a lot of those relationships already existed.
Yeah, right. So this is, I think about the kind of, argument that Vivek Chibber makes in the Class Matrix, where, he basically says, okay, there's this sort of traditional Marxist view that, your analysis of the economic structure should predict working class resistance, and working class non-resistance is this thing that now requires explanation. And, he has this whole argument that if you sort of zoom into the level of individual incentives, it's the opposite, that sort of facts about economic structure actually predict working class non-resistance. Then the vast majority of time, most people have all sorts of incentives to keep their heads down, and, et cetera, et cetera. And that, class formation, doing things like organizing unions, socialist political parties, whatever, is a cultural achievement, right? So it's the opposite of the way it's often perceived. It's okay, the sort of purely economic analysis predicts resistance, and then you need to bring in culture to bring in to explain non-resistance. And he argues that it's the other way around, that you need that actually you need culture to explain resistance. And this is the sort of challenge of building up solidaristic culture. But this the kind of difference you just laid out, right, between 1936 and 2025, I mean, suggests that there were like external circumstances that made it a lot easier, right, to sort of achieve that that like cultural cohesion, right, build up a kind of culture of solidarity in 1936 than right now. So what's the what's the workaround here, right? Because this does seem like a really serious obstacle.
Well, it is a serious obstacle. It's worth saying that even a century ago, the norm was resignation, not resistance. So we think about the 1930s and we think about these heroic strikes, but that was the exception after 70 years of not having that. So it's always been hard, but it's harder today, and because you have to not just convince people to fight the boss. That was really the hard thing in the 1930s, is people were scared of, if they fought back, would they lose their job? So that you had to still do that. You still needed like a cultural organizer dynamic to make that happen. Today, you need to do that still, but in addition, you need to get workers to feel like they're part of a broader collective, and that they have some sort of shared fate with their coworkers. Sometimes that exists in small scales, but a lot of times it doesn't, which is one of the things that we talk a lot about as organizers, and in the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, which is a organization that supports new organizing, which I'm part of. One tactic we talk a lot about is socialize before you organize. So in the past, people were already socializing. You were already socializing with workers. Here, you have to be proactive about it. And it's really, really important. A big part of building an effective union today, if you're trying to do that, is just getting to know your coworkers, getting your coworkers to hang out, not just at work. Might be a potluck, might be grabbing drinks after work. It might be frankly, playing a video game online. It might be having like a group chat where you just talk shit about the boss and share memes, whatever. Like all of that stuff that isn't overtly unionization, but is in fact sort of de facto pre-unionization, is really, really crucial. So you have to put in extra work. That's the short version. There's a reason why union density has gone down. It's because it takes more work today. And that's actually one of the reasons why I'm skeptical of some parts of the labor left that say we can just sort of, eventually we'll get to this sort of an upsurge like the 1930s, in which you just, if you pick the right target, you can set off an explosion. I actually think that there's some aspect of that's true. You still need strategic targets, but to have an explosion, you need to have a lot more sustained fostering today. You need a lot more resources. You need a lot more support than you did 100 years ago. And that's the sort of kernel of truth, I think, in the staff-intensive approach, as they say, in these conditions today, you actually do need to spend more resources. You need to have more expertise. You need to spend more time helping the working class see itself as a class. You can't just sort of rely on spontaneity, if you want to use that word. And so that is a real tension that I think is sort of central to all of the dilemmas we're facing. I can't hear you, Ben.
Here we go. All right. Because we've been spending the last few minutes talking about all the reasons that it's hard, I want to transition into part of the book where you talk about the successes that have happened despite these difficulties, right? So part 2 is called examples of victory, and so chapter 3 is called 3 worker-to-worker wins. So yeah, I mean, I think you've kind of made a compelling case for why this is incredibly difficult. So tell me about the wins. What's matters to succeed anyway?
Well, the first thing to say is that so I give some case studies in the book of important wins. So like the first workers to ever win at a fast food chain, it wasn't McDonald's, but it was a significant fast food chain called Burgerville on the West Coast. People said you couldn't organize fast food. You can never build a union fast food because it's too small. The workplaces, turnover is too high. You have to wait for labor law reform before you could unionize. This was sort of an argument made by unions like SEIU, which had organized the Fight for 15, which was a good campaign, but which didn't really push on unionization really as such. And it turns out like that was wrong. It turns out you can unionize, and they won a first contract in a real hard battle in which workers were fired, in which there was intense union busting, and nevertheless the workers won over the span of 5 years a first contract. And so I give others examples like that. The first coffee chain in the country to unionize, in Collectivo in the Midwest, unionized against extremely harsh conditions, workers fired, intense union busting, it's sort of like the Starbucks campaign, but at a somewhat smaller scale, and they won. And so you can see in these examples and others I give in the book that even in today's conditions, it is possible to win. And not just that it's possible to win, but it's possible to win without needing like an army of staff. These were relatively lightly staffed campaigns because workers themselves, and this is part of the reason to be optimistic, is part of the reason that it's possible now to do a more lightly staffed campaign is frankly a lot of young workers are radicalized, and so you have workers putting in an insane amount of time, like normally in the past you would need a full-time staffer to do, because they fucking hate capitalism and want to like make the world a better place. And you do have these, it's a theme of the book is that in a lot of these different efforts, not all of them, you have young, oftentimes Bernie influenced young workers who maybe on their own initiative read some Jane McAlevey, maybe they read labor notes, maybe they just sort of didn't like the boss and understand that capitalism sucks, so they, and were willing to take that risk. And so this is a commonality actually with the 1930s in which it's young radical workers taking a lead. And so this is one reason to be optimistic, is that there's a layer, and I would argue it still exists today, because there's been a lot of talk about how the youth have all gone to the right. There's some aspects of that for young men, but on the whole, you still have a really large number of young workers who are anti-capitalist. There's some fluctuations, but there is a generation of Gen Z and millennials who really are like overwhelmingly pro-union. This is a new phenomenon. It's really, really interesting because it's not even the case that other countries, this is the norm. And it's not even the case that in the US, most radicalizations in the past were not, particularly, or at least in the recent past, particularly pro-union. I remember like when I was in the anti-war movement in 2003, like weird leftists, Marxists maybe consider themselves, pro-union, but the norm was unions were seen as kind of boring and fuddy-duddy and like maybe like old white dudes, there's like this stereotype. And so now unions are sexy and cool and are something that, people want to build. And there's a class conscious common sense that I think makes it easier to organize than in the past. So you have these examples, you have the youth radicalization, and I would just say the numbers as far as unionization haven't been enough to turn around union density for reasons we can talk about, because the labor movement essentially like sat on the last 4 years, despite there being extremely positive openings for organizing. The union movement did not invest, but despite that, the numbers of workers who unionized actually did significantly go up. We're talking in 2024, over 100,000 workers unionized, about the same number the year before, and about 80,000 the year prior. So in the span of just like 3 years, you're talking over 300,000 workers unionized. This isn't a small number of people. This is like, this is a small army of workers who are still there and who are fighting. It's a lot of power that still exists. And it gives you a glimpse of what could be done if the labor movement decided to actually like invest in new organizing and not just wait for the Democrats to save us.
Well, let's get into that, right? So, because this is something that, I don't know. I mean, I think, I think back to like, God, the end of 2021, where at that point there was like one unionized Starbucks. And I remember being in standing in a bar in LA with a, multiple time past guest on this show who I won't name, who said, who was like, oh yeah, that's great, but nothing really is going to come of this, right? This is just like kind of a flash of the pan. And I remember being very smug, in the following year, as you started to get like all of these, dozens and hundreds, this ridiculous number of Starbucks locations that were organized. But I also think that there's a sort of fair point that, people on the other side of that argument can make, which is just say, well, look, sure, it looks like a lot's going on, and on some level, as you just kind of laid out the numbers, well, a lot is going on, but it's still not moving the needle for overall union density in the United States. So you just kind of suggested that it could be, right? That like we can kind of look at like what the labor movement hasn't been doing to capitalize on this. So make that case for me.
Yeah, I mean, the assumption amongst a lot of people who aren't deeply involved in labor is that if union density goes down, that must be because there's sort of unsurmountable structural obstacles that make it impossible in these conditions to unionize. And so normally this is said, that's why you need labor law reform, of which there's some truth. I do think you need labor law reform, generally speaking, that, that would make it easier. But it's just not the case that the labor movement has been attempting to grow and failing. The labor movement has not really been attempting to grow in a significant way, for many, many years now. And you can just look at the numbers, even compared, you can look at the numbers of amount of funding that the labor movement is sitting on currently. It's higher than it's ever been, unprecedented numbers, talking over 30 billion in assets that the labor movement is sitting on. And that despite having more money than it's ever had, the actual number of staff, which is a metric for organizing, like how many organizers are getting hired, was actually significantly lower during this uptick than it had been even 10 years prior, to say nothing of the 1990s when the labor movement actually did make an attempt to go somewhat seriously on new organizing, in which unions were spending 20-30% of their budgets on organizing. Today, the norm is 5-6%. So all of the uptick we've seen has been despite a labor movement leadership that has done very little and oftentimes nothing to support new organizing. So if you accept the premise that I do, that you actually need significant amount of resources and staff to scale, because my argument isn't at all like, oh, it just, eventually the workers will rise up. My argument is sort of the opposite, is like, actually you need a lot of resources and a lot of support, but you need to do it in a scalable way. Well, then there's no world in which you would expect union density to go up by the hundreds of thousands without a major investment in new organizing. So until we have a real test case where the labor movement puts in money, where it tries to organize the goal it set in the 1990s of 1 million workers organize every year. This was the goal that was set in the late 1990s. Do you know what the goal the labor movement set just 2 years ago in 2022 when Starbucks and everything, it was popping off? The AFL-CIO set the goal of 1 million workers over 10 years, which would have literally been a decrease in union density because the employment would have gone up. So this gives you a sense of the context in which we're working. So yeah, I don't think it's that surprising that union density didn't go up, given the prioritization of the labor movement over these years. Again, if you look at the exceptions, you look at the unions that did invest, they are winning on the whole. The UAW won its first factory in the South. Starbucks has forced management to the bargaining table. I'm actually still pretty optimistic that they're going to get a first contract soon. And so, yeah, there's enough victories to give you a sense of possibility.
Yeah. So why, why have they made that decision? I mean, is it just that the feeling is that it's hopeless and if you spend all this money on organizing efforts now instead of waiting until you have better labor laws, then it's just going to be wasted and you're better off like sitting on it for the future? I mean, what's the counter argument here?
Well, I don't even know how much of it is due to like different arguments. Frankly, we can talk about the arguments that are given, but the major thing is that there's not a strong incentive for a lot of union leaders to invest in new organizing, because from their perch, it's not wrong that is a risky potential investment. And why not just sort of keep on servicing your existing members? This is essentially how the labor movement has declined, is that your average union leader is not thinking about new organizing. They don't see it as an existential threat to their sort of little islands of union power and their salaries, and they're doing fine. Union leadership, they have decent wages. Their union, for the most part, their own members, for the most part, will continue having their contracts. It's just that these are diminishing islands in a non-union sea that's growing. And so for the most part, they can just get by, and then eventually they'll retire, and, they're not thinking about the labor movement as a whole. And, the rational kernel to the people who are skeptical is that it is extremely cost intensive, even, this worker-led level, and risky to try to take on the biggest companies in the world. This is true. Like this is, it's not in any way a surefire bet that you go up and against an Amazon, you go up against a Starbucks, that you're going to win. Oftentimes workers lose. And one of the things that is different than 100 years ago is the labor movement lost a lot more back then, but it fought a lot more. And part of the reason we have of what the labor movement we have right now is it's so risk averse, that it's so worried about losing, that it often doesn't fight, period. It's not even trying to grow. So the threat of losing and the real risk aversion prevents most unions from even attempting to grow. And so that's the dilemma we're in. And the ideological explanation, which is given, which is there's some truth is, we should wait for labor law reform, and then we could, if we had labor law reform, then at that point we could unionize by the millions. But I'm skeptical that this is actually even the major reason why unions aren't unionizing, because if that were the case, you would have expected them to have seized the moment under Biden. Like, Biden made labor law better. Whatever you think about Biden on Israel, Gaza, the Biden labor policy as far as the NLRB was extremely good. Like, the NLRB under Biden and Jennifer Abruzzo was very pro-union, and unions. So all of a sudden, labor law was better, and unions still didn't do anything. So I'm skeptical that the actual thing is that they're waiting for labor law reform. I think it's actually institutional inertia and just conservatism as the main driving factor.
Yeah, I mean, it is also telling. You think about Biden, and it's like, okay, putting aside the rail strike and the decision to invoke the Railway Labor Act and break the strike, stop it from happening. It is true that on a day-to-day basis, right? For the most part, sort of labor law interpretation was way more favorable, right? Because the way that the NLRB was. But it is also telling that, if you think about the Biden years, it's the initial promise, right, was to do actual labor law reform, right, where with the PRO Act, and then for reasons that different people can tell different stories about, that never happened, right? So if that's what people mean by by waiting for labor law reform, not just that we're going to sort of have officials who are going to interpret existing law more favorably, but we're going to actually change the letter of the law in a more pro-worker direction. That didn't happen. That's true, but I also think okay, but hold on, why it's a little bit confusing, why labor law would change for the better in a world where labor didn't wield more political power, which it seems like it's not going to if union density continues to be very bad, right? I mean, it seems like there's at least a somewhat plausible worry that you're just not going to get if you elect Democrats who might not even have it's not like they'd even necessarily be ideologically opposed to better labor laws, but they have very little reason under current circumstances to really prioritize that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And and I think that that's one of the strongest cases for new organizing is that, look, we don't know how far it's possible to unionize under this current conditions, but we do know that there's no world in which the Democrats are going to prioritize labor law reform if not significantly pressured from below. If labor struggles aren't the headline and it doesn't seem essentially to be a deal breaker for these opportunist politicians to get reelected, then it's very hard for me to imagine a world in which they're willing to go up against the entire corporate elite and actually put something with real teeth. And so I think you do need to have both. I actually do think you need politics. The politics does matter. The 1930s, it wasn't just, the New Deal created space, and I think we'll probably need something like that again. But there's no world in which we can expect them on their own to deliver from on high the great labor law reform if there's not significant pushback from below to make this the top sort of bill issue.
Right. Well, I know we have limited time, so I do want to talk about two other things while we've still got you, right? So one of them is chapter 7, which is called Tactics to Win Big. I think we might be able to kind of talk about that, sort of put some flesh on the bones here in terms of what specific tactics you think can be effective here.
Sure. Yeah. In some ways, the book argues a very classical case, which is that I don't think I'm in the book coming up with like any new tactics. So if people are familiar with kind of like deep organizing tactics as espoused by people like Jane McAlevey or Labor Notes, this is essentially what is still works, in which workers, what is organizing? It really comes down to like workers talking to other workers. This is the fundamental thing that makes good union organizing work, is that you go out and talk to your coworkers. You talk to a majority, a super majority of your coworkers. You find out what their issues are. You find the commonalities. You unite people around the widely and deeply felt issues. You build organizing committees of the people who are most willing to put time into making this happen. And then through an escalating series of actions where you test your strength, show the solidarity, build this, you get to a super majority and win a union election, and then keep on organizing to force them to recognize your union and give you a first contract. None of these things are something I've invented. This sort of the labor movement has been doing this for a long time. But the argument I'm making is that even if the model is new, so the model of organizing that I talk about is like a lot more bottom up, less staff intensive, the tactics can still in many ways be traditional. So you don't need to just throw out the old playbook just because workers are taking more of the lead. There's some new things that can be done. I talk a lot, at the end about the need for seizing moments. So this is something that I think is a little bit new. There's tactics for widely seeding drives. I think the UAW has done a really good example of what this could be, because if you're trying to organize by the millions, you need to have tactics to make that happen. The UAW organized an amazing strike in the fall of 2023 that was not just successful in winning wages, but that captured the imagination and attention of auto workers across the country. And unlike every other union, they used that spotlight to then call on all workers in the South and all non-union workers in the auto industry to start self-organizing. So that's what I call seeding, which is essentially you're trying to seed the self-organization. You're not just waiting for workers to spontaneously rise up, but you're actively encouraging and giving them tools to start organizing all across the country. So I think that I would add as like one new and additional tactic that I don't think has been as widely understood in the labor movement. Widespread seeding is pretty essential if you're going to organize very large numbers of workers.
Right. Okay. Well, in the last section of the book, which is called Driving Forces, I think you take on a slightly different sort of reason for fatalism, maybe about organizing prospects than one we were talking about, right? So there's one story that's just kind of purely about, what's the political dimension, right? That we were just getting into. It's like, okay, first you need the great labor law reform, and and then you'll be able to do all of your organizing wins after that. But there's also a kind of fatalism that says that the only things that drive spikes in organizing and successful labor opportunities forward are sort of unpredictable contingent factors, like there being a really tight labor market, because for a while, a few years ago, because of the pandemic. And so basically, sure, when something like that comes along, you take advantage of it. But there's sort of nothing you can do according to this narrative to force it. And a lot of what you're getting into in the last last three chapters, right? So these driving forces are government policy, that's chapter 8, digital tools, chapter 9, and youth radicalization in chapter 10. Like one of the things you start out that section pointing out is that actually a lot of the labor resurgence that we've seen in the last few years started before the pandemic tightened up the labor market, right? So what's the more complicated, hopeful story here?
Yeah, I'm arguing that there are some of these driving forces that are more long-term and that aren't entirely contingent. So for instance, the youth radicalization that I mentioned before, I'm not going to go into that again, but that does really change the dynamics and possibilities for organizing, because you have a layer of people that can play the sort of leadership role across the economy that even 10, 15 years prior didn't exist. There's this real layer of anti-capitalist young workers, and not just college-educated workers, that are out there and that can play this role of taking big risks. But it's not just that. There's the rise of digital tools essentially lowers organizing costs. So social media has all sorts of very negative impacts on the world that I don't think we need to like rehearse here. But I do push back against the excessively doomer narrative that social media is just like going to atomize us all into hell, and everyone's just going to be sort of just like depressed, alone people who are never capable of any sort of collective action. One of the interesting things that I found in the research for the book is that actually a lot of these digital tools have been used for real organizing. They made it easier for workers to start self-organizing in a way that wouldn't have been possible. And that's pretty important because unions are very risk averse, as we talked about. And so when workers don't have to rely to the same extent to start self-organizing, because they can jump on a Zoom instead of having to go to Union Hall, because they can text a worker instead of necessarily having to like pay for a flyer. All of these things that lower organizing costs make it easier for workers to self-organize. So the terrain for organizing, frankly, is just the balance of power between like the union leadership, which is risk averse, and young or just rank and file leaders generally has been, I would argue, irrevocably changed because of the rise of digital tools. Essentially, rank and file workers just have more power than they used to. And that's a very promising dynamic for this type of organizing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that actually might be the most hopeful thing I have heard in a while. I know that you, as we've discussed, you have a meeting that you need to get to in about 4 minutes, so I'm not going to keep you. But the book, one more time, is called "We Are the Union." How worker-to-worker organizing is revitalizing labor and winning big. And I would just generally suggest to anybody watching. I mean, if you are alarmed and depressed by the state of the world for some of the reasons that we kind of talked about at the beginning, and you want to think about the levers of power that ordinary people have to sort of push back and create the kind of society that we want, and then you want to sort of not just like do the kind of lazy left podcaster thing and say like treat we need more labor unions as a kind of magical catechism, without actually like thinking about how that has to work, right? Like how we could turn some of this stuff around. I think Eric's book is a really, really good place to start. So I would strongly recommend people check out the book. Eric, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Ben. Appreciate the flexibility and appreciate you having me on. And thanks to you all out there for fighting the good fight.
All right. Thanks, Eric. All right. I was Eric Blanc. Meanwhile, yeah, nice. I see. I wasn't even prepared for it. The soundboard is so new that I keep forgetting that it exists. Yeah, that was Eric Blanc, smart guy, thoughtful guy. Should read his book. Meanwhile, though, in just a minute, we are going to go to the post game early tonight. So we've been kind of feeding you all these vitamins the last hour, thinking about, sort of this strategic perspective about how to organize the working class and achieve the things the left wants. So, after all that, right, you can certainly have your put in, in the post game, or when you're watching some of the Ethan Klein, Hassan Piker debate. It's just that there's just no. You look at the ingredient list in the back of that thing. There's just absolutely nothing that's good for you. But what the hell? It's the post game. We'll watch some of it anyway.
Yeah, I used to be a union staffer actually. So then I read Eric's book, even though it hadn't come out yet. I guess maybe I was aware of his ideas. I realized I was part of the problem. Right? We don't need staff. I think that's actually not what he's saying.
No, it's very much not what he's saying.
For sake of my joke, let's say I read the book, quit, and said, you know what I need to spend time on? Watching Ethan Klein and just tracking his meltdown, descent into whatever he's descending into. And I was like, that will revitalize the left. Or if not that, at least I won't be part of the problem anymore. That said, actually, as a former staffer, it's that was very, very interesting conversation. And yeah, please, patrons, tune in to see what I've been reduced to.
Yeah. We no, really the part of the problem is this show. We took somebody who was doing useful work in out in the world, and say, oh, no, you don't need to do all that to contribute to the left. Just come out of here, cut some clips,
Yeah.
watch Ethan Klein have a meltdown on YouTube. It's good enough.
Yeah. There was one time where Ben was like, "We need this clip of Alex Jones saying the frogs are turning game, 30 seconds," and I was like, "Ben, I'm with a worker right now who's actually the key to the entire campaign," and Ben was like, "This is your time to decide." So I made.
And this is the decision you made.
Yeah, no, I'm not at that job anymore. That was a good one. First time, Andy, I thought that like a dog was barking. Well, I don't. That's that.
I got spayed or neutered.
Yeah. Okay. Fair. All right. Well.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Absolutely. So I guess. I guess we want to just hit two things before we go to the post game. So one of them is I do have an article out in Jacobin magazine today, which is called yes, the title they ended up going with, whose birthright citizenship and legal equality are worth defending. I think at one point, actually, what would have been the really ballsy title, would have fit the article is America is an Idea. I've kind of been joking with people all day since this article came out that I've actually let JD Vance negatively polarize me into being like outright patriotic and Jacobin. But it is about, like, the article is about, all jokes aside, it is about what I think is actually the best part of American society, right? The thing that if you are going to take pride in something about this country, you should take pride in, which is, I think, precisely the thing that Trump and Vance are trying to get rid of. So it's, the sort of basic, argument of the piece is that, Vance in particular, I mean, Trump's actions all go along with this. Trump hasn't been quite as ideologically crisp and coherent about explaining it as Vance is, because, the man's brains seem to be leaking out of his ears and mouth at a positively Biden-esque rate lately. I don't know if you guys saw the interview where Trump was convinced that Abrego Garcia actually had the letters and numbers MS-13
hilarious
tattooed on his knuckles, right? And you can there were other parts of the interview where you could tell Trump didn't believe what he was saying. He was just bullshitting. But this one, he seemed to he was taken aback that this was a point of dispute, right? The interviewer was like, "No, sir, that's not a real photo." And it was like, "Yes, it is."
He threatened to get it, which is my favorite part. It's like, get it, go, Trump, go.
Yeah, they really should have let him go get it, and so they could have looked at it together. So yeah, I think Trump is, unironically, I actually do think Trump. I mean, he's always been odd and crazy, but I actually do think he's undergoing real cognitive decline right now. But the vice president is still spry and uncomfortably clear about where he's coming from ideologically. So in the piece, I talk about so going back to his speech at the RNC last summer, where he said, people say America is an idea, but that's not true. It's not an idea. It's a nation, defined by, the shared past and blah, blah, blah. And then I think it got even clearer. He had, Vance got into it on Twitter with a couple of sort of, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouths, but these are not people I found at a DSA meeting, right? These are media people who nobody would mistake for being big ideological leftists. Zed Jelani and Jesse Singal. And actually, that was one of the disconcerting things about this, that it's okay, those are both people who I usually follow and interact with on Twitter. And, the vice president of the United States is yelling at them on social media. This is very strange. I don't like it. But in that interaction, there was a point where Vance was like, he was like quote tweeting single, and he's like says, talks about smug, self-assured bullshit, and says that he has a worldview that justifies the invasion. I mean, he's talking about immigration, but the invasion of the country that my ancestors built with their bare hands. And it just seemed to me that it was getting very, very blood and soily. That there is a very unsubtle implication hovering around all this, that the country is in some sense primarily the property of people who have the right ancestors, rather than just everybody who lives here. And so the basic argument of the article is, look, just about all real world nationalisms fall somewhere on a spectrum between pure ethno-nationalism and pure civic nationalism. Like Zionism is like pretty much pure ethno-nationalism, that they're like the nation state law in Israel they adopted several years ago, like says outright, formally, right, Israel's the nation state of the Jewish people, never mind that most Jewish people don't live in Israel and don't want to, and a significant minority of Israeli citizens are non-Jewish. It just says that explicitly. So that's like a form of nationalism that's just completely identified with a certain ethnic subset of citizens. And then somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, you have like European nations that don't have that, but they also don't have like birthright citizenship, right? If you're like the child of like a Turkish guest worker, and I don't know, Germany probably. I'd have to look up some of the specifics, but I think that one's still true. You, even if you're born there and grow up there, right? You're still not automatically a citizen. And then the U.S. actually, my favorite thing about the United States is that American identity is to a remarkable extent by global standards delinked from any sort of ethnic identity. Nobody says, "Oh, I'm a quarter American." It would sound like a category mistake. And this is this is the joke I always tell about how these days, like, nothing makes me feel more patriotic than thinking about Israel, which sounds like a really funny sentence for me to say, given my views. But I don't mean that I don't mean that I swell up with pride thinking about the United States sending 2,000-pound bombs for the IDF to drop on refugee camps. That makes me sick. I mean I feel very intensely grateful that when it was time to get the fuck out of Ukraine, right, the Jewish side of my family came here instead of migrating to Palestine. So I got to grow up in a secular multi-ethnic democracy. And I think that a lot of the Trump stuff, and so like I think a lot of that's about sort of historical contingency, that if you think about the difference between the U.S. and a country like France, where you have over the course of the last couple hundred years, they've gone through like a variety of different forms of government, monarchy, democracy, fascism for a little while under Vichy, and there's this sort of French identity that's like survived all those transformations, right? But American identity sort of came into existence, coextensively with the current form of government, and also, partially as a result of horrible things, right? The dispossession of natives, etc., right? But like the end result is that you have so many people from so many different backgrounds, right? That you don't have one that's just sort of overwhelming, that almost by default, we ended up having this sort of sense of national identity that's inclusive and civic, that's just sort of defined around, allegiance to democratic institutions. And, the world historic victories of the civil rights movement in the 60s really reinforce that, right? I mean, it's sort of doubly true after that, because it's not even sort of linked to even a vague sense of European identity anymore, because of that, right? So it's like, look, through all the good and bad things that led to it, it's like, I think it's a tremendously valuable thing to, I mean, look, I ultimately, I think that my first choice would be that, we just did some sort of, fully automated luxury communist future, right? We just sort of have like a global federation a la Star Trek, right? I think that would be the best, but that is a very long way off from where we are right now. And it seems to me that given where we are right now, I think that sort of inclusive civic sense of American identity is this hugely valuable thing. And it's and those of us who want to sort of liberal capitalist democracy to be replaced by something better and more egalitarian rather than worse and less, right? I mean, it's a really tremendously valuable starting point to build from. And so I think that I think it's a huge mistake to sort of be kind of equally contemptuous of all forms of American identity or whatever, right? That's like a kind of rhetorical posture that some lefties I think are very comfortable with. But it's like, I don't know, man. I think the sort of whatever its tremendous flaws and limitations, I think now that you're kind of seeing this resurgent ethno-nationalist right really challenging that foundation, I mean, it's sort of should become clearer why it's something that's worth defending for those of us who would like to turn it into something better, not something worse.
Well, we didn't have an opening argument today, but I think that's actually a pretty good closing argument. Well said, Ben. I think, and unless we have anything else to advertise or let the fans know about, we're probably gonna get right into the post.
Yeah, let's go.
All right. Well, for all of us here, as I'm buying my time to find the outro, best.